going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you a video posing the question, does Yu-Gi-Oh need more draw power? Now, when analyzing this question, there's a lot of different avenues you could take, but rather than analyzing strictly from a generic draw power standpoint, I actually want to take a different approach and look at it from a semi-generic draw power standpoint. So before I get into that, I do want to shout out my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs to Maria, to Sergio, and to Manny. And if you guys want to help support me and the channel so I can continue bringing you Yu-Gi-Oh content on a daily basis, check out the Patreon link in the description below. But let's get right into it. So when I'm focusing on semi-generic draw power, what do I mean? Well, in terms of generic draw power are cards like Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity. These are cards that realistically you could include in any single deck you wanted, and it's also the reason why they're mainly on the ban list, is because they're just extremely powerful. But semi-generic draw power is different, and we actually have a few examples of semi-generic draw power currently in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Right at the moment. So when you look at semi-generic draw power, a lot of people kind of look at, when you're looking at cards based off of their attributes, what is the strongest attribute in the game? Well, if you're looking strictly from the cards that synergize with any specific attribute, a lot of people would argue that Dark is the strongest attribute in the game. Well, why is that? Well, there's cards in the Dark attribute, or that synergize, I should say, with Dark attribute cards that really don't exist in any other attribute. You have cards like Veil of Darkness, the beginning of the end, and most notably, Allure of Darkness. Allure of Darkness is one of those cards that if you're ever playing a dark deck in general, the first question you kind of ask yourself is, once you get the main components of your deck assembled, you ask yourself the question, can I fit Allure of Darkness in this deck? And it's very common to ask yourself that because it's such an incredibly powerful card. The fact that you get to cycle 2 cards for essentially free, and you're really just digging deeper into your deck, and typically if you're running a mono attribute deck that's solely comprised of dark monsters, usually you might be digging for certain things, and Allure of Darkness has been one of the most expensive cards in this game's history, solely because of the fact that it was one of the most strongest semi-generic draw power cards that we've ever had in this game. I mean, Allure of Darkness has hit $50, if not $60 in its prime back in Dad Return days, and that's obviously an extreme example, but there's so many dark decks that ever since Phantom Darkness was released that Allure of Darkness has seen play. And hell, Burning Abyss is probably, the most notable dark deck of our current days, and people are always trying to fit in Allure just because cycling through your Burning Abyss monsters, because you have so many of them to get to the correct cards that you want, really isn't that big of a deal. But the interesting thing is, when you look at other attributes and what draw power cards are at their disposal, there isn't really a lot of options. Sure, Light attribute may have a card like Cards from the Sky, but Cards from the Sky specifically requires you to have a Light Fairy type monster, and it also comes with a very heavy downside as well. And then you look at an attribute like Water. Water has a card like Moray of Greed, where if you have 2 other water monsters in your hand, you can shuffle those back into your deck and draw 3 new cards. So you're essentially getting to cycle 3 cards, but the interesting thing about Moray of Greed is that because you're shuffling the cards back into your deck, you're not really cycling through them because they're not going to the graveyard, meaning that there's still the possibility you might draw those cards again, even though they might not be the ones that you're particularly looking for. Now, we've still seen Mermail decks play Moray of Greed solely because if they're trying to get to specific combo pieces, they're willing to take that risk, because since Mermail is such a heavy combo deck and typically is comprised of a very heavy water monster count, they can pretty much run Moray of Greed no problem, and it really helps just filter through and get to some other combo pieces, maybe because they need to align them in the proper way. But outside of that, when you're looking at solely mono attribute based semi-generic draw power, there isn't really many other options. I mean, there's plenty of other generic draw power options that obviously have their own stipulations, but the interesting thing is there isn't really that just blanket semi-generic draw power for single attributes, and this kind of makes it so that some attributes are better than others. And yeah, that's obviously going to be the case because not all cards are created equally, and some cards inherently are just going to be better than others, so you kind of have to factor that in. But why can't Yu-Gi-Oh! Incorporate as many, I guess, generic slash semi-generic draw tools as possible so that some decks don't have to suffer solely because they didn't get placed in the proper archetype? So I wanted to discuss 4 different cards and kind of discuss the pros and cons of each of them in terms of a specific mono attribute. So we want to talk about Allure of Darkness. I also want to talk about Moray of Greed specifically, and then we're also going to talk about a card like Six Samurai United if it had to do with attributes, as well as trade-in. So starting with Allure of Darkness, again, imagine if there was an Allure of Darkness for Earth attributes, or Fire attributes, or Wind attributes. Then you always have this card that if you're playing a mono attribute-based deck that you can look at and say, is this a card that I can play in here? Now, that might get a little bit crazy because if you look at some of the mono-based attribute decks we've had in the past, a deck like Zodiac was comprised of primarily Earth monsters. So if you think about it, do you really want to have a deck where if you have multiple Zodiac monsters and you happen to draw your Allure of Darkness for Earth monsters, that's just going to allow you to filter through to get to more cards because you already have your one combo piece anyway, and you can afford to banish one of those 2 Zodiac monsters. So you have to kind of think it's cool because it helps incorporate and really can help other decks that might be lower down on the tier ladder, but at the same time, it also could make decks that are mono attribute that are the best deck of the format and make them just completely over the top and make it so that their consistency just can't be matched by anything else by comparison. Now, look at another card like Moray of Greed. Moray of Greed is very different from Allure of Darkness. Now, you do get to see 3 cards instead of 2, but very similarly, like I said before, you're not ditching that 1 card out of your hand after you allure. You're not going 2 cards deeper, you're putting 2 cards back and then drawing 3. So that actually makes a very big difference because that means you have the chance to draw the cards that you don't want to see. Where Allure, you draw the 2 cards first, you get to go in deeper and then choose what you want to banish. So those are 2 very different cards, but again, imagine if there was a Moray of Greed for like Earth monsters or Fire monsters or just Light monsters. And I know Light monsters have some other semi-generic draw power in cards like Solar Recharge for Lightsworn and things like that, but again, there isn't really anything, like imagine if Trickstar is a deck completely comprised of light monsters. Imagine if Trickstar had the ability to access a card like a light-themed Moray of Greed. I mean, it would allow you to put some cards back, draw more cards, and potentially get you to maybe your, just anything else that you may need in that instance. Like you would want it, I don't think you would want to particularly cycle back your monsters, but maybe you drew the Lilybell, for instance. The Lilybell is a card that you never want to see in your hand as a Trickstar player, but because you're playing a light-themed Moray of Greed, maybe you open a hand that's full of monsters, maybe you have like 3 monsters and the light-themed Moray, you can shuffle back Lilybell and maybe like a Lycoris, draw 3 new cards, and now the Lilybell is back in your deck, meaning that you can tutor it out later through some of your other cards' effects and special summon it and do all the shenanigans with the Lilybell. So there is some application there. Now take a card like Six Samurai United. So this is another different approach where it's a card that derives draw power from summoning monsters. So there's a lot of different aspects that they could take advantage of when it comes to generic draw power. So maybe the fact that you're just giving them an instant like 2 for 2 or 3 for 3 is a little bit too much, but Six Samurai United, if it was mono attribute based, would allow you to do some really cool things. So if you were to special summon or normal summon a fire monster or an earth monster or a wind monster, you know, once you get 2 monsters summoned, then you could send that card to the graveyard and draw 2 cards. Now, the disadvantage of a card like this is the fact that it would be very susceptible to being hit by removal, but that's a really big deal because at the same time, that's a little bit of a check and balance on the card so that it's not just completely and utterly busted. That way, your opponent actually has an opportunity to stop it, and I know your opponent can stop cards like this with Ash Blossom, but there's even more ways to stop a card like a mono attribute themed Six Samurai United, more so than, let's say, a themed Allure of Darkness. And that gets us into our last card, Trade-In. So Trade-In is very notorious in decks like Blue Eyes and Dark Lords, but again, there isn't really anything that just says discard 1 fire monster, draw 2 cards. Now again, there could be definitely stipulations on the card to make it a little bit more balanced, but one of the inherent disadvantages of a card like this is that if it does get hit by Ash Blossom, it is a -1 for the player using the mono attribute themed trade-in. However, if your opponent doesn't have the Ash Blossom, having a card like this allows you to filter through your deck much more quickly, and I would say is a little bit more fair than something like Allure of Darkness, because Allure of Darkness puts you to a higher card count, and then you get to select what you want to remove, whereas a trade-in, you have to pitch your target first, meaning you have to already have it, and then you get to draw your 2 cards. So that's a little bit more fair compared to something like Allure of Darkness, but again, you start to think about all of your favorite decks that are mono attribute and start to think maybe there would be some advantages, and maybe they'd be able to go just a little bit higher up the tier ladder if they had some semi-generic draw power at their disposal. It's really interesting when you just start to really ponder all the different uses and abilities that you could really derive off of something like this, and having that access to cards like this for all of these different decks. I mean, there's Magispectors that are pure wind. I mean, they could have just an insane amount of time with having all the draw power at their disposal. There's so many different mono attribute themed decks in this game because Yu-Gi-Oh! Pretty much restricts us solely to just mono archetypes, and typically archetypes are the same attribute more often than not. Obviously, a deck like Spiral isn't all the same attribute, but there are decks, and typically the decks in the past are all the same attribute. I mean, we've had Zodiac, we've had Necroz. I mean, I could just keep going on and on and on, but it's really cool to think that if something like that were to exist, I would love to see if in Flames of Destruction, because it is flames and I guess fire themed if you want to go there, if we got like fire generic draw power. Again, I don't think it'll happen, but I think it'd be really interesting for the long term of the game if it kind of made the attributes a little bit more balanced in terms of equity, and really just kind of, instead of differentiating them so far apart in terms of their generic cards that are available at their disposal, then kind of giving them all equal footing so that the player base can experiment and see what they can do with these particular cards and use them to the best advantage that they can. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this theory about semi-generic draw support when it comes to single attribute decks. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. It's something that's been on my mind, and I'm really curious to hear what you guys have to say. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video insightful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time. 1, 2, 3.